Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. We are in the midst of observing the sesquicentennial of the Civil War in the year 2012. But my guest reminds us that 2012 is the bicentennial year of another war, a war that is sometimes called the Second American Revolution, a war that very heavily involved Kentucky. My guest is an old friend of the program, John Robertson, Professor Emeritus here at the college, historian, author, and Marine Corps veteran. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
The War of 1812. Our good friend, Jim Hammock, the late Jim Hammock of Murray State University, wrote a book in 1976 about the War of 1812 in Kentucky, and it was called the Second American Revolution. Let's begin by looking at some of the causes that led to this war, that we decided round two with peevish Mother Britain was in store. So what were the causes of this conflict?
Well, it appeared originally to be a continuation of the problems they had on the East Coast. You know, they had the Orders in Council, they were seizing American vessels, and they were stopping even American warships and taking off. They never admitted that a person born in England could become an American, particularly a sailor. So it started out as an Eastern war, but the ones that pushed it heavily were a new force in American history. That was the frontier. That was in particularly Kentucky. Kentucky sort of took upon itself to make that its cause. And so, in fact, they suffered over half the casualties as a result. So this is a Western war, which is different from previous American history.
And
a big thing there is the Indians had a major influence in Kentucky's desire to get Britain out of, well, Detroit, and having what they felt to be a bad influence on the Indians to our frontier in Kentucky.
And of course, this is where we see the rise of an up-and-coming young Kentucky politician, a Speaker of the House named Henry Clay.
Henry Clay.
Leader of the War Hawks,
Yes.
who were mostly Southern and Western congressmen who were just itching for a fight with the British. And of course, you mentioned the Indians, and that's absolutely correct, that the Kentuckians believed that the British were inciting the Indians. I would submit that the Americans were actually the incitement, since they were killing them and taking their land. The British were putting weapons in their hands. The Battle of Tippecanoe, 1811, which is sort of a presage of this war with Tecumseh. And what was Tecumseh's dream to?
Well, Tecumseh was a unique figure in American history. He was Shawnee, and his brother, the prophet, younger brother, thought he was the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the second coming perhaps. Drank a little much too, and kept giving Tecumseh problems. But he felt that the land was not up for grabs. It belonged to everyone. And we felt that land was something that we could possess. And there's the basic difference between the two cultures. And he did something that few previous Indian leaders ever tried. Tecumseh actually began to talk with other tribes, even those south of the Ohio River, although his mother had come from there. So we began to see the nucleus of what could have been the Indians occupying from the Great Lakes down to the, maybe all the way down to the Mississippi River.
He was talking about a confederacy of tribes.
And he wanted all the Indians to agree on at least their opposition to their encroachment upon the sacred land, like the Kentuckians were doing after the Battle of Point Pleasant, when they'd forced the Shawnee to move further north and were beginning to come into the Northwest Territory. And so we were treating the Indians as if they were animals, and the Indians began to resent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you have here the fuel for a major set-to.
Mm-hmm.
And then Prophetstown on Tippecanoe Creek, where the brother set up his shop. Well, it was a threat, and the governor of the Northwest Territory, William Henry Harrison, decided he had to do something about it. And he'd had a conference with Tecumseh. And Tecumseh spoke good English. He was a rare individual who was fluent in many different dialects. And Tecumseh began to lay out his plan, and Harrison just denied it. And Tecumseh got angry and gave him a lecture, so much so that Harrison became scared and actually started to draw his sword.
Mm-hmm.
And his bodyguards came in, so
Mm-hmm.
they came close to blows there.
I have a quote of Tecumseh's reply to William Henry Harrison, which I often read this to my students. And Tecumseh said, "The Great Spirit said he gave this great island to his red children. He placed the whites on the other side of the big water. They were not contented with their own, but came to take ours from us. They have driven us from the sea to the lakes. We can go no further. They have taken upon themselves to say, this tract belongs to the Miamis, this to the Delawares, and so on. But the Great Spirit intended it as the common property of all the tribes, nor can it be sold without the consent of all. Our fathers tell us that we have no business on the Wabash. The land belongs to other tribes, but the Great Spirit ordered us to come here, and we shall stay." And that's precisely what you're saying, this confederation. And Tecumseh, then he goes south to line up support from these southern tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And according to legend, he crossed in southern Illinois at a place called Pilot Rock, which is on the way if you go from going up toward Cave and Rock.
But it gives a good vista.
Oh, a beautiful view. And it's one of those things, if he didn't actually do that, well, he should have, you know. I always tell students that a lot of these stories, if they're not true, they should be. It's a great story, and it's a beautiful view of Kentucky from up there. And he told the prophet, do not engage the whites if they come to do battle, to disperse and fight again another day. Did his little brother do what he said?
Well, of course not.
Of course not. I speak from experience. I have a younger brother myself, and he did not, and the result was disastrous. I mean, the Confederacy, this battle blew it completely apart. And that's, and you're absolutely right. This is a Western. This is where Kentuckians get involved. We tried economic sanctions against the British. Mm-hmm. that failed. The embargo.
The embargo is an interesting thing. If you write it backwards, it's "Oh, grab me."
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's a famous cartoon showing the impact of the embargo.
Right.
It's a turtle, and it's grabbing the United States.
Yeah.
So, but it hurt the people on the East Coast.
It did.
And it was trying to solve a Western problem,
right.
the Indians,
right.
by what? Sanctions against
right.
and the merchants on the. So it tended to divide America east and west.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
And a group in the West wanted to be heard, and a lot of them came out of Kentucky and Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And they became known as
the Warhawks.
The Warhawks.
Of course. Right, right. And then, of course, these economic sanctions, the embargo was lifted. Then we tried
Non-Intercourse Act.
And I really, my students, that they look like this, and I said, well, you understand that this term means trade.
Yes.
And of course they're thinking, what does birth control have to do with this trouble? And then along comes Bacon's Bill number 2, which unbeknownst to the Americans is actually having an effect. And you mentioned earlier the Orders in Council. And of course we're kind of whipsawed with this because the French under Napoleon have their Berlin and Milan decrees, which say you can't trade with the British. The British have got their Orders in Council, which say you can't trade with the French. And as neutrals, technically, don't we have the right to trade with whom we please?
No, not according to the Brits.
Exactly, but I mean, in terms of technicality, in terms
Yes.
of international law,
that,
technically we do. But again, as you know, it's a war of national survival between the British and the French, and they're not about to do this. So anyway, and I always found this interesting about this war is we finally declared war on the 18th of June, 1812, and 2 days before, Lord Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary, goes to Parliament and says the Orders in Council will be lifted. 48 hours before we declare war. And again, in teaching students, as you know, students today, we live in an age of instant communication. Well, how long does it take to get a message from the United States to Great Britain or vice versa in 1812?
Well, how long did it take even to get it out of London?
Exactly. And I try to explain to students that first this thing has to be handwritten physically out, a document, put into a dispatch case, taken down to the waterfront, put on a sailing ship, down the Thames, around England. It could take literally weeks. And what I found fascinating about this is President James Madison doesn't get word of this until the 12th of August.
Yes.
And then he decides not to go back on the declaration because he still hasn't heard the British reaction to this. So, you know, lack of communication, I always tell my students, causes lots of problems.
Well, so many, you mentioned that, they don't realize that a sailing ship follows the course of the winds.
Exactly.
And from Columbus on, that means they would sail south, not directly across from England to America. They had to go south, following the trade winds, and then come back up the coast of America. And then, but going back, it was much quicker. The winds going to Europe were favorable, but not coming here. So it took a long time for a message to get all the way back.
And I think that's important for people to
yeah,
realize.
Samuel Eliot Morrison makes us a point. Of course, he was an admiral.
Oh, a great historian. Yeah. But again, you know, when you're dealing with, we're all 21st century people, we think, well, you could get on the telephone and that'd be, and it's fascinating to speculate, had the United States known 50% of our war aim, well, Ian, and you're right, it was the Indians and then the trade situation. Well, 50% of our war aims, the British have wiped out.
Conceded.
And you wonder, would we have gone to war?
I think so, because the West was beginning to have a say-so in national affairs. And they stood to benefit from a war with the Indians. In fact, Tom Clark makes the point that during the War of 1812, Kentucky manufactured and sold 300,000 pounds of powder.
Wow.
So Kentucky was willing to
financial interest,
gain from a good war.
Right.
And also they, when the war started, Kentucky insisted on being the leader of it. And the war now is in two phases. The first part is in the east, and it goes badly. And then the war concludes in the west.
Right, in New Orleans, right.
So that is the shift of power from the old East Coast United States to the new frontier out to the Mississippi River United States.
And of course, we were talking earlier, vestiges of this powder industry can still be seen in Mammoth Cave.
Oh, yes.
We toured Mammoth Cave last year, and they've still got all the wooden apparatus that they used in the processing of this gunpowder there. Absolutely. Well, Henry Clay, the leader of the Warhawks, he has his war. He's a happy man, and Kentuckians are enthusiastic to volunteer. And didn't Clay, in effect, say that the Kentucky militia, virtually by itself, could take Canada?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And,
piece of cake.
Clay and one other Kentucky, I think it was Ronley Bonley, was it?
Richard M. Johnson,
yes.
Rumsey Dumpsey, yes.
They didn't volunteer initially for the service. Clay
Clay
never
never
had any
did.
military
He
experience.
didn't, but Johnson will, of course, go
Yeah, he
later.
will.
But yeah. And I always find it interesting is, you know, Clay begins the war as this hawk, but he winds up being a dove because he's helping negotiate the Treaty of Ghent.
Yes.
So, but you're right. Of all the bellicosity of Henry Clay, he let others do the actual fighting up there. What I also find fascinating about this is we have reelected our first governor, Isaac Shelby. He is 62 years old and goes to the legislature and asks for special permission to lead Kentucky troops in combat at the age of 62. So he becomes a hero of two wars, Battle of Kings Mountain and the Revolution, and now he's going to Canada with these 3,500 men that he raised.
And look at the difference in the two wars. The Battle of Kings Mountain was a frontier, long rifles. The Brits were out slaughtered. And here in the other, the people just swarmed out on their own and came down to Kings Mountain. They brought their own rations with them.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're going to have to supply an army moving through what is now Illinois, Indiana. People today don't realize how difficult that would have been in 1811, 1812.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was swamp. That was no good roads.
You're right. It's
And,
still a frontier.
They went out without provisions for winter clothes, and they caught up with them too. In the first attempt of the Kentuckians to move north, they wound up nearly freezing to death, and with no rations and no supplies, and particularly no artillery.
Right. And of course that brings us to the battle that came as a very rude awakening to the Kentuckians, the Battle of the River Thames. The Battle of the River Raisin.
But even before that, Hull.
Oh yeah, who shamefully surrenders Detroit. And I always tell my students down now, you know, the British go off script here. The way this is supposed to go is they wait for us in Canada. We go up and whip them. But no, they go off script and they come down and capture Detroit. Now we've got to go up and clean them out of Detroit. And this River Raisin battle in the winter, and you're absolutely right, the key, the British have artillery and the Americans don't. And it's a disaster. And then Kentuckians are massacred after the battle.
Well, the prisoners were, because
right.
the British allowed them to surrender, and they did. They had quite a few casualties, but quite a few wounded. And the Brits put the wounded in a building, and then they leave. And this impacts even today on Western Kentucky. We remember what happened at the River Raisin.
Right.
Because look at the names. The first 4 counties to be authorized in the Jackson Purchase were what?
Pascal, Hickman County. Of course, Benjamin Graves in Graves County, and Virgil McCracken in McCracken County, and even Bland Ballard, who was
later,
there.
yes,
Who will come later. You're absolutely right about that. And the thing about with the British, they leave and say we'll send equipment back for the wounded, and of course, if you're a Native American, this is payback time. Right. These are the people who've been killing your folks. They've been taking your land. It's payback time. And so remember the Raisin becomes a battle cry for Kentuckians.
Because they killed at least 67 wounded that had been promised safety.
And you got to wonder too, at this time, this was supposed to be so easy. And now it was a huge shock to Kentucky that, wow, this may be more difficult than we imagined. And so from the Kentucky's great victory in the War of 1812 is the Battle of the Thames.
Oh yes.
In Canada, and of course that immortalizes Richard Mentor Johnson. And
also Tecumseh.
Yes.
Tecumseh had been at the Battle of the Raisin. He was a major influence. In fact, he was made a brigadier general in the British Army and turned it down. And by the way, he threw his red coat away. But he was still considered to be a loyal British officer.
Yes.
And in Canadian history, he is held up as one of the great defenders of Canada.
He is, and what's fascinating about that, several years ago, we, on a vacation, we went up to that part of Canada. It used to be called Lower Canada, and we went to the battlefield, and it was fascinating to see, as you said, Tecumseh is the great hero of this battle. Yes. Richard M. Johnson is not even mentioned, and we went to a little museum. And the fellow there said they did have a book. It's a very old book of Kentuckians in this battle, and he said people would come up occasionally and ask about it. But the other thing that amused me too was the River Thames in Canada is a glorified creek at the best. It's,
yes, very small.
So in this great, and to describe this battle and the heroism of Richard M. Johnson, he becomes this great Kentucky
Well,
hero.
The Brits, of course, and they had militia, Canadian militia, and by the way, the York militia is very proud of their role in the American Civil War.
Sure.
Because they were the defenders of Canada. Well, they were in line, you could see them, but where were the Indians?
Of course, hidden.
And there was
the
a great,
underbrush.
we didn't know how many, where they were, and they were on the flank, and so something had to be done. Well, so Richard Johnson and other mounted cavalry, I guess you'd call them, kind of peculiar looking. They had on top hats and carried pistols and a sword, I guess. Yeah. But a group of them called the Forlorn Hope, rode out. The only purpose was to draw fire so we would know where the Indians were and where to attack.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember what happened to his horse?
Yeah, annihilated. I mean, wow.
But his horse was shot.
Oh yeah,
4 times.
Some unbelievable amount of bullets. The horse.
So the hero may have been the horse.
I agree. We don't even know what the horse's name. You know, yeah. And I'm in the Forlorn Hope. Another story about Kentucky that I really enjoy is William Whitley, who was also 62, and he was among the Forlorn Hope who died. And as he told his men that if he were to be killed in Canada, that he knew they couldn't bring his body back, so they would just to scalp him. Now there's no evidence that they did that, but another thing about William Whitley, of course Whitley County's named for him.
Yes, and he supposedly killed Tecumseh.
Yes. Yeah, there are more than one claim to have done the deed. But when Whitley so hated the British that when he built his house, there was a racetrack. And of course, in Britain, horses run clockwise and on grass. He made them run counterclockwise on dirt, and that supposedly is why all races in America, including stock car races, go around kind of counterclockwise. And of course, horse races are on dirt. Johnson, I love this about this fellow was a congressman, as you said, and he never said he killed Tecumseh, but he never stopped you from saying it.
Well, when he ran for office, he had well, everybody has to have a ditty, you know, for a candidate.
Right, and his is a beauty.
Oh, his is a beauty.
Rumpsy Dumpsy, Rumpsy Dumpsy, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh. And again, whether he did or not, we don't know. But quite an interesting, very colorful character.
Oh, colorful. What? We're bringing up a touchy subject here, too.
Yeah.
He overtly violated all social conventions and yet became the Vice President of the United States. And to date, he is the only Vice President to be elected by the Senate.
He did.
Not by the people.
And of course, the convention that he broke, his wife was African American, and he didn't hide it. And that is amazing.
Her name was Julie
Chin, wasn't
it?
Right.
They had 2 daughters.
Right. And going back to his birth, when he was, another story they would tell about him, which he probably told on himself, was that when he was a child, I guess it would have been Bryan Station. A flaming arrow struck his cradle. And
before the arrow came in, his mother had, well, they were desperately short of water. And the Indians were nowhere to be seen at Bryan Station. So she convinced other women to go with her. They went out and got buku buckets of water and brought them back in. And she was sitting in the fort when the arrow came through the wood, hit the cradle where he was.
Right.
And she grabbed one of these buckets and poured it out.
Right. What a great story. And that's another one, if it's not true, it should be. That's a wonderful story about him. So the war drags on, and of course the British were a bit preoccupied in Europe with a fellow named Napoleon, and it doesn't look like we're going to take Canada, but it also doesn't look like that they're going to take us either.
Well, we tried to cross into Canada one time, and the Battle of the Niagara, it was called. Wood takes some American troops and goes over into Canada, and the Canadians, the York militia, stop him, and he's desperate for help, and the American militia comes up from New York and will not cross the river. They will not serve outside of their home state.
Right. And that brings up another story, one of my favorite Kentucky stories, and that's the famous story of the Militia Pig. You know, we Kentuckians are very sentimental souls, and of course, throughout the history of warfare, military units have always had mascots. And this was a pig, and the story went, these soldiers were from Harrodsburg over in Mercer County. And they were going to be they were heading north to Newport to cross on up to Canada to join Harrison. And not far out of Harrodsburg, they saw two sows fighting in a mud wallow. And of course, that would stop Kentuckians naturally. And you can bet they were laying bets on that too, as to who would win. Well, the winning sow fell in behind these fellas, and she just kept going. They went all the way to Newport. The sow trailed them all the way. She swam across the Ohio. They went off on a boat. They went up through the state of Ohio, up to Lake Erie, and what made me think of it was, you know, you can't compel a militia soldier to cross an international frontier. So the sow just stopped. They went up into Canada, and they ended up getting defeated, obviously, and then they came back, and the sow was waiting for them. And I tell my students that these fellows were tired and they were hungry, but oh no, they did not kill her. She went back with them across Ohio. They crossed at Maysville this time, and the sow collapsed from just sheer exhaustion or whatever. And Isaac Shelby said, I will pay money to have that sow nursed back to health, and she is then to be brought to me, to my farm in Lincoln County, where she will spend the rest of her days, as Collins wrote, in ease and indolence.
Ooh.
And Shelby's home was destroyed years ago by fire. But there is a family cemetery that's a little state park. It's actually not very far from Danville, which is the next county. This is in Lincoln County. And we went there, and I looked, and of course, obviously the pig's grave was unmarked. So I just did a 360 and just, you know, to memorialize the pig, I was thinking good thoughts as I did my turn around there. But what a great story. I mean, the governor of Kentucky adopts a pig in there. One of the things we did in crossing into Canada was to burn their capital.
Oh, yeah.
York.
York.
The
Put
capital,
it to the torch.
Lower Canada, and that was just a delightful thing to do.
General Ross, I think, made a point on that too. The British General Ross. Because what do?
It's tit for tat. They're going to burn our capital. And of course, this also brings up kind of a side point. Columbus, Kentucky, which I believe is your wife's hometown, and you've written quite a bit about that. As a result of them burning Washington, the legend spread that the capital will be moved to Columbus, Kentucky.
Well, that is a story that comes up later.
Right. Well, tell that story. It's a great story. It's a great story.
Well, I found some newspapers in an abandoned house from Columbus, and it goes into some detail about all of that legend of moving the capital. The capital had been moved several times, and you know, British chased them up and down the East Coast.
Yeah.
But supposedly it failed by one vote.
Right.
There's nothing really to back it up.
Right.
I could find at least, it may be. But I looked diligently and didn't. But after the 1860s, this editor of the paper in Columbus began to insist that they should move the capital further west, and where would it be better than any place else?
Absolutely.
And St. Louis was pulling for it, and so he gave all the reasons why it should come to Columbus. And that, I think, is the origin of the legend.
Right.
It was the 1860s, not
Oh, absolutely. But you know, it is so fanciful. I've even heard stories from old Columbus residents that they can show you the spot where Jefferson came and stood and said,
oh, yes,
or
Thomas
James Madison too.
And nothing there.
No, absolutely. That they stood and said, "This is the new capital."
It's going to be the capital.
But again, obviously, it stems from the fact that Washington was burned.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Ross did a pretty good job on Washington. Now, of course, Dolly Madison had presence of mind enough to save some of the more valuable things before they burned the White House.
And I'll tell you a funny story about that. Of course, the most valuable thing that she saved was the famous portrait of Washington, which is in the National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah, but she damaged it in the process.
She did, but she at least saved the thing.
She saved
it. And I remember the first year I taught, I had prepared what I thought was a very dramatic lecture on this, because after all, I mean, the British are coming in, and another thing I love about this story is that I try to set the scene for my students that the British have come up the Chesapeake Bay and they've landed their troops and they're coming up a road, and I said, you can just see this, can't you? I said, there's one man standing in the road. It's Henry Clay. He's got his pistols and his rifles and all this kind of stuff, and his overturned wagon. I said, no, he wasn't there. He was in Ghent, Belgium, trying to get this thing over with that he had started. Well, anyway, another thing I love about this too was near the town of Bladensburg, Maryland.
Yes.
The Maryland militia turned out, and the British put them to flight.
Oh.
They ran so fast they called it the Bladensburg races. Anyway, and so they're coming into the capital, and it's an amazing. Of course, Admiral Cockburn, who's the commander of this raiding party. Anyway, as the British are approaching, Dolly Madison, you could just see her scurrying around, and don't take that. We've got to get this, got to get going here, got to get out of here. And I said, and Dolly Madison was able to escape from the White House with, and this kid said, a cupcake. And I thought, Dolly Madison, that's what you know Dolly Madison for, the cupcakes and that sort of thing. But it's a very dramatic scene, and then they burned Washington.
Well, the only troops that really fought at Bladensburg for the Americans for any length of time were the naval contingent. Of course, they were Marines, but the if it's not true, it should be.
Right.
But Dolly, of course, her husband was with the troops. Mm-hmm. And so she had to make the decisions for the defense of Washington, D.C. on her own. Mm-hmm. And she did salvage what she considered to be the most important documents.
Yeah. And it's,
So, but they went on down and approached Baltimore. Now, Baltimore was a different story.
Tougher nut to crack.
And on the way, Ross was killed.
Right.
And here is where Packenham really comes in, because Ross was commander-in-chief of the British in North America, and later Packenham gets the same post.
He does. Well, getting back to Washington too, the stories that they go into the executive mansion, which they're going to burn it. And the story I've always heard is that there was actually a meal
on the table.
On the table, and they helped themselves to this meal, and then decided to, I guess, walk it off. And they went to the Capitol building.
And defecated in all corners.
They did that indeed. And then they, the story that is fascinating is they go into the House chamber, and there's the Speaker's chair, empty, Clay's chair. And Cockburn actually sat in the chair and assembled his officers below and said, gentlemen, the question before this House is, shall we burn this palace of Yankee democracy? All in favor say aye. And it was unanimous, and he gave a two-word command, light up. And they burned it. And of course, they burned the Capitol building, and they burned the executive mansion. And as I tell my students, we obviously want to build these back. This beautiful executive mansion, this beautiful stone has been scorched and burned. And they decided they couldn't, well, they tried to get the scorch marks off. It couldn't, and they painted it white. And now we call it the White House. And that's how it got the name for it. A terrible calamity. But it did point out, I think, that the vulnerability of having a capital so close to the sea. It would be vulnerable to any, and especially in later wars.
Right.
With World War I and II, you've got German submarines off the coast of the United States. And you can see why there might have been a movement to move the capital inland.
Move the capital
And
inland.
especially since we're west is where we're going
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, the idea was to move it to the geographic center, and of course it kept moving west.
It does. It does. It does. So that's tit for tat. Baltimore, they're coming up the Chesapeake Bay, heading up toward the Patapsco River, and there's this Fort McHenry. And the British think, well, that's Marylanders again. We'll get rid of them in a hurry. But what happens?
I'm never sure about when I was teaching names, but I always heard it was Coburn, Admiral Coburn.
Really? No, there was a Coburn. There was two of them. It was Cockburn and Coburn both. There were two of them. You're right.
Well, anyhow, the British fleet came up, and they had new weaponry, Cosgrave rockets.
Mm-hmm. Which must have been terrifying.
Oh, but completely inept as a weapon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And now the Baltimore militia stopped the army moving up, and of course Ross was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And that took the army out of the battle.
Mm-hmm.
And they hoped to, destroy the fort, and then they would surrender, and that would be the end of the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But the fort didn't.
Right.
But all night long they fired those rockets and the bombs.
Well, the rockets glared and the bombs burst in the air. And son of a gun, the next morning, that flag, it was still there. You know? That's kind of catchy, I think.
And he grabbed his old envelope out of his pocket
and decided this is
Francis Scott Keys.
And he wrote this poem.
And to an old English drinking song on F&M.
But it is a high class.
It's a high class, but it's also a high tenor.
Yeah, exactly.
It was designed not for a normal singer, but for a good tenor.
Well, you know, it's funny. I'm not a musician at all, but it must be very difficult to sing properly because a lot of people have botched that in a lot of public places. But yeah, to Anacron in Heaven, and actually, we were at Fort McHenry several years ago, and it has many verses, more than we usually sing. And as you get deeper into the song, the more virulently anti-British it gets. They're all but calling dogs by the end of it. And I remember back when, after 9/11, there was a very moving service at St. Paul's Cathedral involving the Queen and Prince Philip and all the family and Tony Blair and all the British bigwigs. And at one point in that, they sang the Star-Spangled Banner. And I tell my students that I was very touched with that, but off in the distance I could hear this buzzing sound. It sounded like perhaps someone spinning in a grave. And that was old Pakenham, who was buried in the cathedral.
And Ross.
Yes, absolutely.
Ross was a fine general.
Yeah.
They lost their most effective leader with him.
And Pakenham was no slouch either.
No, he was the brother-in-law of the British general who had defeated Napoleon.
Oh, well, Duke of Wellington, yes,
Duke of Wellington.
Yeah.
And he was only 36 when he came over here.
Right.
And he had successfully fought in one of the most vicious campaigns against Napoleon in Spain.
Oh, the Peninsula Campaign.
Peninsula
yes,
campaign.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So he was a good general.
Oh, he was.
But when he came to America, he and the admiral did not get along, and that caused some problems. And they came up and they got 10 miles from New Orleans when Jackson didn't even know they were around. Mm-hmm. They had a battle on one of the lakes, and the American ships were cleared out, and then Pakenham wanted to go ahead and attack. But the admiral said, no, we've got to bring up the supplies and stuff like that. So there was a split in command there. But here, something else happened. When they got approaching New Orleans, most people don't know, but Andrew Jackson attacked them December 23rd. Mm-hmm. And that's where he suffered the most losses in the Americans in the campaign. Mm-hmm. He suffered almost equal losses to the Brits. Mm-hmm. But he stopped them long enough because there wasn't anything to stop them above that. But they gave him time enough to fortify the Rodriguez Canal.
Correct.
And to extend it into the swamp to anchor the flank.
Right.
So even though Jackson, his impetuous attack failed. He discomforted the Brits to the point that he was able to really mass all the firepower he had in a limited front. At the redoubt there, he had Tennessee and Kentuckians lined up shoulder to shoulder, 10 rows deep.
Right.
And the first row would fire and fall back, and they could just keep up a muzzle.
Destroy.
Just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And Pakenham calmly marches up and decides, well, we'll assault a fortified position. And they'd had time enough to do their fortifications properly. Have you been to Chalmette?
I have.
Scary.
It is.
You look at what they do.
Oh, it's an open ground. It's a charge across open ground. But meanwhile, negotiations in Ghent, Belgium are bearing fruit.
Yes.
That I think, but this time both the Americans and the British decide that this is not what we want to do.
They want to get it over with.
This is really not, neither one of us are making any headway.
But the American delegation was divided too. Henry Clay stayed up all night playing cards and drinking.
Right.
And John Quincy Adams, of course, said his prayers at 7 o'clock and went to bed.
Exactly. Yeah. Quite a contrast, those two. But later on, their political paths will indeed cross in a positive way for both of them. So we get the war begins with this strange juxtaposition of dates. 24th of December, 1814, the peace is signed. The war is over, but Pakenham doesn't know this, and neither does Jackson. And so the stage is set for the biggest and bloodiest battle of this war, the Battle of New Orleans. Again, as you said, Kentuckians are involved in it.
And even though the treaty had been signed that no, everything status quo antebellum, no change, even had that, if they had taken New Orleans,
that would have been interesting.
They would not have given it back.
It would,
They were determined to discomfort the Americans.
And that would have been, that's a fascinating historical what if. What if the British had won this battle? Would they have gone back on that treaty? Well, I'm sure they would have. Well, anyway, coming down, the Kentuckians come down, and one of my favorite stories is that several of the Kentuckians arrive without weapons.
Oh, all of Adair's troops.
Yeah, and Jackson said, and I'm going to paraphrase it, I have never seen a Kentuckian in my life without a gun and a bottle of whiskey and a pack of cards. Which, come to think of it, I haven't either. But then one of the Kentuckians replied, well, General, we'll just follow your Tennesseans in the battle, and if he gets killed, we'll inherit his gun. And that was a very typical Kentucky response.
Well, they tried to give them old Spanish muskets they had in the arsenals in New Orleans.
Right.
And they wouldn't work.
They were useless.
The Kentucky troops would, they were useless for a long period just prior to the battle.
Yeah, yeah.
And
again, to set that battlefield, it's the Rodriguez Canal, and I wish we had a map here, but it runs from a swamp all the way across the Chalmette plantation. Oh, that's a good image there. Yeah, all the way to the river. And so Pakenham is going to teach these, they call them dirty shirts, a lesson, a direct frontal assault to show them what British military might is all about.
And put the Scotties on the right.
Absolutely. Of course, the Scots are always the cannon fodder. You know, let them go first. They seem to like this stuff. And the description of that battle, it was a cut cane field. So there's cane stubble. And I tell my students that you've probably walked across, some of you have, a cornfield, and you can push the corn stalks over, but cane you can't. It'll trip you. And so you're going to have to do this frontal assault across this wide open space under murderous fire. And there are a number of accounts of the British forming up just out of range. You can see the glint of it frosted that day. There's an account of how the whole area is covered in this silver frost early in the morning, bright, cold, clear day. And the British troops are forming up. It's January the 8th of 1815. And you can see the glint of the muskets, and then they come in their typical lines.
They had some pickets out, and they were our Indians out in the, and they would fire letting something, but the sight, from the American position, it was hard to tell where the Brits was, or where they were. Get my verb correct. But there is an account of an eyewitness from the top of the breastworks defending New Orleans. This is from the Battle of New Orleans in the Eyewitness of History.
Mm-hmm.
And Colonel Smiley from Bardstown was the first one who gave us orders to fire on our part of the line. And then I reckon there was a pretty considerable noise. And directly after the firing began, Captain Peterson, I think he was from Knox County, Kentucky, but an Irishman born, came running along. Now he jumped up on the breastwork and stooping a moment to look through the darkness as well as he could, he shouted with a broad North of Ireland brogue, "Shoot low, boys, shoot low, rake 'em, rake 'em. They're coming up on all fours." He thought they were crawling up. Well, you couldn't see because there was mist, as you said, and early morning. And then when the fighting starts, the mist, it just fogged everything over with smoke. It was so dark that little could be seen until just about the time the battle ceased. The morning had dawned, to be sure, but the smoke was so thick that everything seemed to be covered up in it. Our men did not seem to apprehend any danger, but would load and fire as fast as they could, talking, swearing, and joking all the time, and all the ranks and sections were soon broken up. And after the first shot, everybody loaded and banged away on his own hook. Now, Henry Spillman did not load and fire quite so often as some of the rest. But every time he did fire, he would go up to the breastwork, look over until he could see something to shoot at, and then he would take deliberate aim and crack away. But the legend we have here is what? This is the gallant Kentuckian
Ephraim Brink.
Ephraim Brink.
From Greenville.
From Greenville.
Muhlenberg County.
And his story is...
Oh, well, he climbs up on the parapet and he walks back and forth, this angel of death, and he takes a shot and he never misses
but
any
the
kill.
Hat.
Oh, the broad-brimmed hat.
Yeah, there's supposed to be a British officer who reported seeing him up there.
Absolutely. There is. There
Yes.
is. And I think the point you made is a very good one, is in these battles, and you see these fanciful pictures of these, well, like this one, of these battles, that everything is clear. Well, it wasn't.
No,
This black
not with
powder.
black powder.
Oh, with black powder smoke.
And heavy, moist.
On top of that, it's impossible to see, and that's why I always tell my students that in a battle in this period, you really got to watch the colors very carefully, because when the colors go forward, you go forward, and when they go back, you can't, and that's about the only way to communicate. Another fanciful image we have here of old Hickory himself standing up on the parapet.
Yes, that.
Yeah, that definitely didn't happen.
He definitely did not do that.
I mean,
he had
you'd
more
have to
sense than that.
have a death wish to do that. But it does show the Scottish troops.
It shows us fighting with bayonets too, and that probably was not.
No. And again.
But look how clear that is.
Oh, absolutely, and of course it would not have been at all. And but it does, at least it shows the Scottish troops in their kilts. They were always the shock troops for the British forces.
We also remember the movies like Charlton Heston, standing up there.
Oh yeah.
Oh, they did a great thing in the movie. They showed the Scotties attacking.
Right.
And they had the way they shot the movie. They took 20 Scotties and lined them up against a bunch of mirrors, and it showed them all. But in the movie, it looks like there are 1,000 of them.
Oh yeah.
And boy, all those bayonets come down at the same time. They start marching forward. Very dramatic.
That's seriously, of course, now with special effects, they just use the computer and do it.
Yes.
But I had forgotten about that movie where Charlton Heston plays Andrew Jackson. Do you know the name of the movie? I forget.
I don't remember.
But it was, absolutely, very, very fanciful, the whole thing. And
but that's what we have.
Right.
We have the legend of New Orleans.
Right.
And the real thing, well, like Packingham, supposedly Brack from Greenville, Kentucky, shot him.
Right.
At 500 yards.
Right. And
hit him between the eyes or something.
Of course.
But Brank actually was hit by cannon canisters. And by the way, we had heavy artillery, and this Battle of New Orleans was really won by artillery, firing canister.
Yeah, right.
And they hit, and he fell off his horse. His horse was hit too.
Right.
His aide came up, McDougal, somebody, I forgot.
Mm-hmm.
But he picked him up and put him on his own horse. And immediately he was hit in the knee and knocked his knee clear out and knocked him off the horse. And then finally he was, the second time on the A's horse, he was hit again by cannon shot and got him in the spine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so after the battle, they took him home, put him in a cask of rum,
Did indeed.
and shipped him home for burial
did
in
indeed.
Ireland.
They did indeed.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that too is there's a British expression for getting drunk called tapping at the Admiral.
Yes, yes.
And it goes back.
Wellington, to Nelson.
Actually, actually before that, there was a story that this British admiral died in the West Indies, quite hot, and they put him in the rum cask because British at one time every day in the British Navy you got a small rum ration. By the way, it was more for the officers than the enlisted men.
There was grog too. It was a heavy rum.
It was strong, really strong stuff. Actually, a British friend of ours told us the brand it's called Pusser's rum. It's a very heavy grog. It is. It's very powerful stuff. And I said, well, what if you decide to save up for 30 days? He says, no, you use it or lose it. Absolutely. But anyway, the story was told was they put this Marine guard on the on the keg, and they bribed him. And when they got back home, it was all gone. and anyway, that's a really funny story about it. But the other story about New Orleans, Pakenham brought his wife along, and she heard the gunfire and assumed that her husband's forces were winning, and instead he was brought back dead among the casualties in this. And I have read, and I'm sure you have too, this was one of the worst defeats ever inflicted on a British army in history.
Oh, yes.
And as I tell my students, the British have a whole lot more in the win column than the loss column. This was just an utter disaster.
And I still say the massed artillery.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
part of those were supplied by the pirates, Jean Lafitte.
Oh, yes.
They were on the river battery. Dominic U.
And it's fascinating, this army that Jackson had cobbled together. You have Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana militiamen.
Yes.
You've got local fellows who thought it would be kind of fun to do this. They turned the jail out.
And they also enlisted the free blacks.
Free blacks as well, absolutely. And then Jean Lafitte's pirate. It's this completely undisciplined hodgepodge army. And they're going, and I tell my students, they're going up against soldiers who had beaten Napoleon, professional, best soldiers in the world.
The best soldiers in the world at the time.
And yet this American force, and the casualties were something like the Brits lost around 2,000, and I think American casualties were fewer than 20. It was just some.
Well, at this battle, but remember earlier on the 23rd.
Yeah. But in this particular battle, it was a slaughter.
Yes.
And I remember reading an account after it was over, Jackson himself was peering over the parapet, and he said something to the effect, "This is what Judgment Day must look like, because all the wounded got up from among the dead and staggered off the battlefield," which is this incredible scene of this. And it's a national park today, and we were down there 3 years ago, and of course Hurricane Katrina just devastated this park, just swept it away. There was something like 12 feet of water over, and in this image in particular, you can see how close it is to the ocean, to the river, because that's a ship going upstream.
It's going right by.
That's how close it was. But
and that's the river battery, of course.
Yeah, and I mean, they had these things, and of course there were notches cut in that parapet, and they fired through there. It was just devastating effect. But it does create a national hero, Jackson, the greatest hero since Washington, and he'll do well in the presidency. John Adair goes back to Kentucky and does rather well as well. Governor, as well as Adair County is named for him. Now, we got about 4 minutes left. It seems to me that the Second American Revolution is a good title for this war. If the British had any intention of taking us back, they were disabused of that notion. And this is when the United States begins to rise, isn't it, as a nation?
And it's also the creation of Canada as a identity in itself.
It does, indeed, indeed. And what I find fascinating about it is our war aims were to stop this violation of neutral rights. Well, once the war in Europe ended, that took care of itself. And then we tended to forget about that business about taking Canada that we kind of didn't do too well on. So we focused on New Orleans, you know, we focused on the last battle. But it's a tie. As you said, status quo antebellum, we gain no territory, they lose no territory, we gain no money, they lose no money. But
never again to the Brits.
Absolutely. So strategically, you'd have to say it's an American victory. And what's fascinating about it is, and then as the years pass, we become closer and closer to the British. And as I tell my students, the next time a U.S. soldier is on a battlefield with a British soldier, it's as an ally. It's an ally in First World War. And I just don't think this war gets the publicity that it should, because it really cemented, to me, the American Revolution.
Well, there's one little, perhaps, you realize that during the war with Spain, Spanish-American War, a British correspondent was with the Cubans, and his name was Winston Churchill.
Right.
And he thought the Cubans should win.
Yeah. Oh, you mean the Spanish?
The Spanish.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But in Cuba.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. And of course Churchill's mother was an American.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating war, and I hope that what we've talked about today will stimulate some interest in this. Jim Hammock's book is probably out of print.
Yes, but it's quite good.
It's a very good little book.
Robert Remedy has good books.
Absolutely, and certainly Remedy's works you can find probably online, and to read more about it, because again, this is Kentucky is involved in this war from beginning to end, up to the hilt, and again, it produces Richard M. Johnson, who, by the way, is buried in Frankfort in the cemetery, and on the bas-relief on his tombstone, there is the famous engraving of him on the horse where he's doing the pistol like this, and the Indian is doing like this. So, and there it is. And again, that campaign slogan, I mean, you know, he was a Democrat, but even if you're a Whig, that's a great slogan. Rumpsy Dumpsy, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh, and he might not have, but rank has its privileges, doesn't it? So these other men, these other fellows who claimed it, but the Colonel, of course, he prevails, doesn't he? Yeah. So, well, we're out of time. Enjoyed this thoroughly. We'll have to come back again and talk about perhaps Kentucky and the Civil War at a later date. So, thank you for joining us. I'm Barry Craig. We will see you next time.
Thank you.